My hands were shaking on the control panel, and I could not make them stop. Every alarm on my bridge was silent, every screen was calm, and yet my body knew something my mind had not caught up to yet. I am Vorn Kale, fleet commander of the Vekthari border guard, and on that day I stood at the front window of my flagship and stared into a patch of empty space that felt wrong in a way I could not explain. We had 30 warships lined up along the border that day. 30 ships that I had trained with for years, crewed by people whose names I knew, whose families I had met at supply stations, whose children waved at me during inspection tour. 30 ships that I had once believed were more than enough to handle anything the humans could throw at us, because the humans, as far as our intelligence reports told us, had almost nothing to throw. That was the story we had been told for 2 years. The humans were a new species, barely out of their own solar system, still arguing among themselves about how to build a single unified government. Their ships were slow. Their weapons were weak. Their colonies were small and scattered and poorly defended. Our council had looked at every report, every scan, every piece of gathered data, and had decided that humanity was not a threat. Some of them had decided humanity was an opportunity. I remember the meeting where Counselor Yoren Thess stood in front of the war table and said the words that changed everything. He said that if we moved now, while humanity was weak and divided, we could claim their border colonies before they even understood what a real fleet looked like. He said it would not be a war. He called it a correction, a reminder to a young species about where the true power in this part of the galaxy lived. I did not like the word correction. I still do not like it. But I was a commander, not a politician, and when the council votes, the fleet moves. So we moved. 30 ships slid quietly toward the border, engines humming low, weapons systems on standby, waiting for the order that would turn a tense border patrol into something much worse. My aide, a sharp young officer named Sella Wren, stood beside me that morning with a data pad in her hand and a strange look on her face. She had been with me for 3 years, and I had learned to trust her instincts almost as much as my own sensors. That morning her instincts were telling her something was not right, and she did not know how to say it without sounding foolish. "Commander," she said quietly, "the human patrol ships that are supposed to be watching this sector have not moved in 6 hours." I looked at the display. She was right. 3 small human scout vessels sat motionless near the edge of the contested zone, engines idle, no communication traffic, no course changes. It was strange but not alarming. Scout ships sat still all the time. Crews rested. Systems powered down for maintenance. There was nothing in that stillness that should have made the hair on the back of my neck rise. And yet it did. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself that any commander preparing to cross into contested territory would feel this same tightness in the chest, this same awareness that history was about to be written, and that my name would be part of it for better or for worse. I told myself the humans were exactly what the reports said they were: small, weak, unprepared. I did not know yet how wrong that word was. Before we crossed the border, I spent one final hour walking the corridors of my flagship, something I did before every mission, a habit I had kept since my earliest days as a young officer. I liked to see the faces of the people who trusted me with their lives, to remind myself that every number on a chart, every ship in a formation, represented a person with a family waiting somewhere behind us. In the engine room, I found a young technician named Corin Vale adjusting a coolant line, humming quietly to himself, unaware that his commander stood watching him work. In the mess hall, 2 off-duty crew members argued cheerfully about which star system had the better food, laughing in a way that made the ship feel, for a moment, less like a weapon and more like a home. I remember thinking, as I walked back toward the bridge, that whatever happened at the border, I wanted to bring every one of those faces home again. That hope stayed with me as I returned to my station and watched the border grow closer on the main display. A thin, invisible line in the dark that somehow felt heavier than any wall of stone or steel could ever feel. We received our final orders 2 hours later. The council had approved the advance. We were to cross the border, take position near the human colony of Ashgrove Station, and issue a formal demand for the colony's surrender under threat of force. It was meant to be simple. Show the guns. Watch them fold. Claim the territory before the humans even understood what had happened. I gave the order to advance, and 30 ships moved forward together, engines burning bright against the dark of space. I stood at my window and watched the stars shift as we crossed into territory that, until that moment, had belonged to no one and everyone. Sella stood beside me, quiet, watching the same stars, her jaw tight. "Commander," she said after a long silence, "may I ask you something?" "Go ahead," I told her. "Do you believe the reports about the humans?" she asked. "Do you believe they are really this weak?" I did not answer right away. I had asked myself the same question more times than I wanted to admit. Every piece of data said yes. Every scan, every intercepted transmission, every economic report our spies had gathered over 2 years of careful watching said the same thing. Humanity was young. Humanity was divided. Humanity was not ready for a war. But there was something in the quiet of those 3 scout ships that had not moved in 6 hours. Something in the way human colonies along the border had grown strangely silent over the past few weeks. Something in the way our long-range sensors kept reporting faint interference patterns that our engineers could not explain and eventually stopped mentioning in their reports because no one wanted to admit they did not understand what they were seeing. "I believe the reports are what we have," I told her finally. "Whether they are true is something we are about to find out." She nodded, but she did not look satisfied. Neither was I. We continued forward, closing the distance to Ashgrove Station, a mid-sized human colony that our reports described as lightly defended, mostly agricultural, home to perhaps 80,000 people. It was meant to be an easy first target, a demonstration of power that would not require real fighting, only the presence of overwhelming force. As we drew closer, I ordered a full sensor sweep of the area. What came back on the screen made my stomach tight. The colony's shipyard, which our reports said contained 12 small transport vessels and 2 aging patrol ships, was empty. Not damaged, not destroyed. Empty, as if every vessel had simply been moved somewhere else, quietly, without any of our long-range sensors ever catching a hint of it happening. Sella leaned over the console, her eyes narrowing at the readings. "Commander," she said, "this does not match the last survey. The last survey was taken 11 days ago." "I know," I said. "Where would they take 12 ships without anyone seeing them leave?" she asked. I did not have an answer. I ordered a wider sweep, pulling in data from every sensor buoy we had placed along the border over the past year. The results were the same everywhere. Human shipyards that should have been full were empty. Human colonies that should have been bustling with daily trade traffic were quiet, their communication channels carrying only routine, almost scripted messages about weather and crop reports, nothing about the massive fleet now crossing their border. It was as if the humans already knew we were coming and had decided, calmly and without panic, to simply get out of the way. I ordered the fleet to hold position outside Ashgrove Station rather than approach directly. I wanted more information before I moved another ship closer. Some of my officers questioned the delay, eager to complete the mission and return home with a victory to report. I told them patience was not weakness. I did not tell them that something in my chest had gone cold and would not warm again no matter how many times I told myself the humans were weak. We sent a small scout craft ahead to make direct contact with the colony's communication array. It returned an hour later with a short recorded message, calm and polite, informing any visiting vessels that Ashgrove Station was currently operating under standard civilian protocols, and that all trade and diplomatic inquiries should be directed through the proper channels. There was no mention of our fleet, no panic, no warning shots, no plea for mercy, just a calm, almost bored-sounding voice reading out a message that could have been recorded months ago. Sella looked at me after we listened to it a second time. "Commander," she said, "that message does not sound like people who know an armed fleet is sitting outside their front door." "No," I agreed, "it does not. Which means either they do not know we are here," she said slowly, "or they know exactly why we are here, and they are simply not afraid." I did not answer her. I did not have an answer that would not frighten both of us further. I ordered the fleet to maintain position, sensors at full alert, and I retreated to my private quarters for the first time in 12 hours, not to rest, but to sit alone with the growing certainty that something about this entire operation had already gone wrong, long before we ever fired a single shot, long before the council in their comfortable chambers back home had any idea that the war they were so eager to start might already be lost before it began. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark of my quarters, listening to the low hum of the ship's engines, and I kept thinking about the empty shipyard, the calm recorded message, and the strange stillness that had settled over the entire border region like a held breath. I had commanded ships for over 20 years. I had seen colonies panic. I had seen enemies bluster and threaten. I had seen fear expressed in 100 different ways. I had never seen this. A silence so complete it felt deliberate. By morning, the reports waiting for me on my console had only grown stranger. Our long-range sensor network, spread across dozens of buoys along the border, had begun flagging something we had never seen before. Human colonies that should have shown steady, ordinary signs of daily life, transport ships coming and going, communication chatter, the small routine noise of thousands of people simply living their lives, had gone almost completely silent over the past 3 weeks. Not all at once, which might have triggered alarm sooner, but gradually, colony by colony, like lights being switched off one at a time across a great distance. I called Sella to my ready room, along with our chief intelligence officer, a careful and thoughtful man named Doran Vess, who had spent his career studying patterns most people never noticed. He stood at my table with a stack of data slates and a look on his face that told me he had not slept much either. "Commander," he began, "I want to show you something, and I want you to understand that I have checked this 3 times because I did not believe it myself the first time." "Go ahead," I told him. He pulled up a chart showing cargo and supply movement across 12 human colonies near the border, tracked over the past 2 months through trade records our economic observers had gathered. "Notice the pattern here," he said, pointing to a steady climb in the graph. Grain storage, medical supplies, fuel reserves, all of it rising sharply beginning about 7 weeks ago. Not the kind of rise you would expect from normal trade growth. This is stockpiling. Deliberate, coordinated stockpiling across colonies that are hundreds of light years apart from each other. "Coordinated by whom?" I asked. "That is what troubles me," Doran said. "There is no single order we can trace. No announcement, no public directive, nothing in their news channels explaining it. It is as if every colony administrator simply knew, on the same week, to start preparing." I asked him to show me the raw data behind the chart, and he obliged, pulling up individual shipment records from each of the 12 colonies. I studied them one by one, looking for anything that might explain the pattern away as coincidence, a shared harvest season, a routine supply cycle, anything ordinary. I found nothing ordinary. The colonies were spread across such distances that a shared harvest season made no sense, their growing conditions entirely different from one another, some cold and mountainous, others warm and tropical. Yet the stockpiling had begun within days of each other, almost to the hour when I lined the records up side by side. Doran noticed the same thing and simply shook his head, unwilling to offer a theory he could not prove. "There is one more thing," he added quietly, almost reluctantly. "Our listening posts intercepted a handful of private communications between colony administrators over the past month. Most of it was mundane, requests for supplies, questions about logistics. But 3 separate messages from 3 different colonies with no apparent connection to each other used almost identical language when referring to what they called the coming inspection. Not an invasion, not an attack. An inspection, as though whatever they were expecting was something they had already been told to prepare for calmly, without panic, the way a household prepares for a visit from a strict but familiar relative. Sela crossed her arms, frowning at the chart. Prepared for what? Doran hesitated before answering. My best guess, he said carefully, is that they were preparing to not need outside supply lines for a while, as if they expected disruption, as if they expected exactly what we are doing right now. The room went quiet. I stared at the chart, at the neat, steady lines climbing month after month, and I felt that same cold weight settle back into my chest that had first appeared outside Ashgrove Station. There was more. Doran pulled up a second chart, this one tracking outgoing civilian transport from smaller, more exposed colonies near the border, places with populations too small to defend themselves if real fighting broke out. Over the same 7-week period, these colonies had shown a slow, steady decline in population, families relocating deeper into human territory in numbers too large to be normal seasonal movement, but too small and spread out to appear as an obvious evacuation. They are moving people, Sela said quietly. Not all at once, not in a way that would show up as panic, just quietly thinning out the places most likely to get hit first. That is my assessment as well, Doran said. I sat back in my chair, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. 2 years of intelligence reports had told us humanity was young, disorganized, and unprepared. Every piece of evidence had supported that story, right up until the moment we crossed the border, and now every new piece of evidence was quietly, methodically contradicting it. Either our intelligence had been wrong for 2 years, or someone had wanted it to be wrong, had wanted us to believe exactly what we believed, right up until the moment it no longer mattered whether we believed it or not. I need to speak with the council, I said. The conversation with the council happened 3 hours later, through a secure channel that connected my bridge to the war chamber back home. Councillor Yoren Thess appeared on the screen, along with 2 other council members, all of them looking pleased with themselves, clearly expecting a report of easy progress. Commander Kale, Yoren said, I trust Ashgrove Station has surrendered by now. We have not moved on Ashgrove Station, I told him, and I explained everything: the empty shipyard, the calm recorded message, the stockpiling, the quiet relocation of civilians. I watched the pleased expressions on the council's faces slowly shift into something more guarded as I spoke. This is nothing, Yoren said finally, waving a hand dismissively. Frightened colonists moving their families inward, stockpiling supplies out of fear. This is exactly the behavior of a weak, disorganized species preparing to hide rather than fight. It proves our reports correct, not wrong. I do not believe that is what this is, I said carefully. This does not look like fear to me. It looks like preparation. Another council member, an older woman named Ithra Saul, who had always struck me as more careful than the others, leaned forward. Commander, she said, what would you have us do? Withdraw the fleet based on empty shipyards and quiet farms? I want more time before we advance further, I said. I want to understand what we are actually facing before we commit to taking Ashgrove Station by force. Yoren's patience was clearly thinning. Commander Kale, he said, you were given command of this fleet because of your discipline, not your imagination. The humans are weak. Every report for 2 years has confirmed it. You will proceed with the operation as planned, or I will find a commander who will. The channel closed before I could respond. I sat alone on my bridge for a long moment, Sela watching me from across the room, waiting for orders I did not yet know how to give. Commander, she said eventually, for what it is worth, I think you are right to be cautious. I appreciate that, I told her. It does not change what I have to do next. We held position for another full day, gathering as much information as we could before the council's patience ran out completely. During that time, something happened that I still think about, even now. One of our smaller escort vessels, running a routine patrol along the edge of our formation, reported a brief and unexplained sensor glitch. A flicker of something on their scanners that appeared and vanished in less than 2 seconds, gone before anyone could get a clear reading. The crew dismissed it as equipment malfunction and moved on. I made a note of it, but at the time, buried under everything else we were trying to understand, it did not seem important. Sella came to me late that evening with a small data pad and an expression I had not seen on her before, something between disbelief and dark amusement. "Commander," she said, "you should see this." Our economic observers picked up chatter on a civilian human trade channel. It seems some of the border colonies have started a small betting pool. "A betting pool," I repeated. "On how long it will take us to figure out we made a mistake," she said, and despite everything, despite the weight sitting on my chest for 2 days straight, I almost laughed. Almost. The humor did not last. Because underneath the strange joke of it, underneath the casual, almost mocking tone of a species that our reports insisted should have been terrified of us, there was something deeply unsettling. Fear does not joke like that. Fear does not sit calmly and place bets on the outcome of an invasion. Only confidence does that. Only a species that already knows how the story ends behaves that way. I did not laugh again after that. Later that night, unable to sleep, I asked the ship's historian, an elderly officer named Bram Idris who had served in 3 previous border disputes with other species, whether he had ever seen a pattern like this before. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. "Once," he said finally, "many years ago before your time, we approached a species called the Osthery with the same confidence we carried into this border, certain of our own strength, certain of their weakness. They too grew unusually quiet in the weeks before our fleet arrived. We assumed it was fear. It was not. It was patience. When they finally revealed the true size of their defenses, our council chose to withdraw entirely rather than test them, and we spent the next decade negotiating a peace neither side particularly trusted. I asked him what had happened to the commander who led that fleet into the border. He looked at me with an expression I did not fully understand at the time and said simply, he retired shortly afterward, and he never spoke of that day again, not even to his own family. I did not sleep well after that conversation, and I found myself watching the star charts long into the night, searching for shapes in the dark that I hoped, against every instinct now telling me otherwise, were not really there. Over the following hours, more strange pieces began falling into place, each one small on its own, but together forming a picture I did not want to look at directly. Our engineers finally managed to isolate the source of the interference patterns that had been quietly appearing on our sensors for weeks, faint and inconsistent, easy to dismiss individually. When they layered every recorded instance together on a single chart, spanning the entire border region over the past 2 months, the pattern that emerged was not random noise at all. It was movement. Slow, careful, overlapping movement, as if something large had been passing back and forth along our own border, again and again, close enough to leave the faintest of traces, never close enough to be caught directly. Sella stared at the chart for a long time without speaking. "Commander," she finally said, "how long would something have to sit still or move slowly enough to leave a trace this faint?" "I do not know," I admitted. I did not know a great many things by that point, and each new report only added to the growing list. What I did know, with a certainty that had nothing to do with data charts or sensor readings, was that the confident, dismissive story we had been told about humanity for 2 years was not simply incomplete. It was a story someone else had wanted us to believe, carefully built and carefully maintained, right up until the moment it stopped mattering whether we believed it any longer. I gave the order to hold the fleet in place for 1 more day, council patience or not. I needed to understand what we were about to walk into before I sent a single one of my crew into whatever was waiting for us at the border. I did not know yet how little that extra day would matter. I did not know that the humans were not hiding from us at all. They were simply waiting for the right moment to stop hiding, and that moment, though none of us on the bridge understood it yet, was already close. The order to advance came at dawn, ship time, though there is no true dawn in open space, only the artificial rhythm we keep to remind ourselves of the lives we left behind. Counselor Yorin Thess had run out of patience overnight, and a new message had arrived on my console before I had even finished my first cup of stimulant tea. Proceed to Ashgrove Station immediately and secure the colony's surrender. Any further delay will be treated as a failure of command. I read the message twice, then set it down and looked out at the stars for a long moment. Sella stood beside me, silent, waiting for the decision she already knew I had no real choice but to make. I could refuse the council and be removed from command within hours, replaced by someone eager to prove their loyalty with force. Or I could follow the order, move the fleet forward, and hope that whatever strange, careful preparations the humans had made turned out to be nothing more than caution, not the opening move of something far larger than any of us understood. Bring the fleet to full alert, I said finally. We advance on Ashgrove Station. Weapons ready, but I want every ship holding fire unless fired upon first. I will not be the commander who starts a war over an empty shipyard and a betting pool. Sella nodded and relayed the order. Around us, 30 ships came alive with quiet purpose, engines building toward full power, shield systems humming to life, weapons crews taking their stations with the practiced calm of people who had trained for this moment for years without ever truly believing it would come. I felt the deck vibrate gently beneath my feet as my flagship, the Ember Crown, began moving forward, the rest of the fleet falling into formation around us like a slow, deliberate wave. We closed the distance to Ashgrove Station over the following hour, the colony growing from a faint point of light to a visible cluster of structures, agricultural domes and modest orbital platforms circling a quiet blue world that our reports insisted held nothing more dangerous than farmers and children. I kept watching the sensor displays, waiting for something, anything, that would explain the strange stillness that had followed us across the border like a shadow. Commander, Sella said suddenly, her voice tight, I am picking up a transmission. It is not from the colony. It is broadcasting on an open channel, no encryption, no source identification beyond a single tag. Put it through, I said. The voice that came over the bridge speakers was calm, almost gentle, a man's voice speaking our language with only the faintest accent, as if he had learned it recently but thoroughly. To the approaching fleet, the voice said, "You are entering a region that has been designated for observation. We recommend you hold your current position and stand by for further contact. This is not a request made in anger. It is made in the interest of avoiding an outcome that none of us would want." I stared at the speaker, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just heard. It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was a calm, almost polite warning, delivered with the kind of confidence that made my chest tighten in a way no threat ever had. "Trace the source," I ordered. Sella worked quickly, her fingers moving across the console, but after a moment she shook her head, frustration and something close to fear crossing her face. "Commander, the signal is not coming from the colony. It is not coming from any fixed point I can identify. It is coming from everywhere around us, layered across a dozen different frequencies, as if it is being broadcast from something that surrounds our entire formation." I felt the cold weight in my chest turn into something sharper, something closer to true fear. "Hold formation," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Do not fire. Do not advance further. Full sensor sweep, every system we have right now." The bridge crew moved with practiced urgency, every scanner and detection array aboard the Ember Crown straining to find whatever had spoken to us, whatever had somehow surrounded 30 warships without a single sensor catching the faintest hint of its approach. For a long, terrible moment, the sweep came back with nothing. Empty space. Ashgrove Station ahead of us, quiet and still. Our own formation around us unchanged. Nothing else. And then space itself began to change. It started at the edges of my vision, faint at first, like a heat shimmer rising off warm stone, distortions rippling across the black in patterns too large and too numerous to count. I gripped the edge of my console, my breath catching in my throat, as the shimmering grew stronger, spreading outward in every direction until it seemed the darkness itself was breathing. "Commander," Sella whispered, and I had never heard her voice sound so small. The first ship appeared without warning, without sound, simply present where a moment before there had been nothing. It was enormous, easily 3 times the size of my flagship, its hull dark and angular, running lights blinking softly along its length like the slow heartbeat of something ancient and patient. I had barely registered its presence before a second ship appeared beside it, then a third, then a dozen more, spreading outward in every direction, filling the space around Ashgrove Station and our own small fleet like water filling an empty container. They did not stop. Ship after ship after ship shimmered into existence, some small and swift-looking, others so massive that my mind struggled to process their true scale, all of them appearing in near silence, without weapons fire, without aggressive maneuvering, simply revealing themselves, layer after layer, until the black of space between the stars had become a solid wall of human vessels stretching farther than my sensors could reliably measure. I stood frozen at my window, watching numbers climb on the display in front of me, watching a count that had started in the dozens rise past 100, past 500, past 1,000, still climbing, the fleet unfolding around us like a curtain being drawn back to reveal a stage that had been fully set long before we ever arrived. Sella's voice cracked as she read the final tally. "Commander," she said, "sensor estimate places the total human fleet presence at over 4,000 vessels, currently holding position, weapons systems inactive, no aggressive movement detected." 4,000. I had brought 30 ships to this border, confident in a report that told me humanity possessed barely more than that in its entire military, scattered across 100 colonies. And in the span of perhaps 90 seconds, that report had been revealed as either a catastrophic failure of intelligence or, far more disturbing, a story humanity had allowed us to believe, carefully and deliberately, right up until the exact moment they chose to stop pretending. I could not speak. I stood at my window, surrounded by a bridge crew who had gone utterly silent, every one of them staring out at a wall of human ships that dwarfed our own formation so completely that the word fleet no longer felt adequate to describe what we had brought to this border. We were 30 ships. They were a horizon. Somewhere behind me, I heard one of my younger officers, a weapons technician barely out of training, whisper a question to no one in particular. "How long?" he asked. "How long were they there before they showed themselves?" I did not have an answer, and in truth, I did not want one because every possibility that came to mind was worse than the last. Had they been cloaked the entire time we crossed the border, watching our every move, listening to our every transmission, patient and silent while we debated whether their species was even capable of building a real fleet? Had they been there for hours, days, longer? I forced myself to move, forced my hands to steady themselves on the console, forced my voice to sound like the voice of a commander rather than the voice of a man staring into an abyss he had helped dig with his own hands. "All ships," I said, my voice carrying across the open channel to the rest of my fleet, "hold position. Do not fire. Do not advance. Shields up, weapons on standby only. We do not provoke this." Across the channel, I could hear the strain in my captain's voices as they acknowledged the order, every one of them clearly seeing what I was seeing, every one of them clearly understanding, in that same terrible instant, that the war we had come to start had never truly been ours to win. The human fleet did not move to surround us, did not close the distance aggressively, did not do anything that could be mistaken for an attack. They simply held their position, an impossible, silent wall of ships stretching in every direction, patient and unhurried, as if they had all the time in existence and had simply chosen, at last, to let us see exactly how much of it they had spent preparing for this moment. Sella stood beside me, her eyes fixed on the display, her voice barely above a whisper. "Commander," she said, "the council told us they were weak." "I know," I said. "They told us we would win this before it even began," she said. "I know," I said again, because there was nothing else true enough to say. I stood at the window of my flagship, surrounded by 4,000 ships that had appeared from nothing in less than 2 minutes, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its certainty, that whatever happened next, the war the Council had wanted so badly to fight was already over. It had ended the moment humanity decided to let us see the truth. A single new transmission request appeared on my console then, quiet and unassuming among the storm of alarms and reports flooding every other system on the bridge. It was addressed directly to me, by name, by rank, by the designation of my ship, as if whoever was sending it had known exactly who I was long before I had ever known they existed. Sella looked at me, waiting. Before I answered the transmission, I allowed myself one final moment to simply look at what surrounded us. The wall of human ships stretched in every direction, some near enough that I could make out fine details along their hulls, delicate lines of light tracing patterns I did not recognize, symbols that might have been names or numbers or something else entirely. Others sat so far in the distance that they appeared only as faint points, indistinguishable from stars except for the way my sensors insisted, again and again, that they were something else. I thought of the 30 ships under my command, small and outmatched in a way I had never imagined any fleet of mine could be, and I thought of every crew member aboard them who had trusted me to bring them home. Whatever came through that transmission, I understood, would decide whether that trust had been well placed or tragically misplaced, and there was no way to know which until I heard the words myself. "Open it," I said, and braced myself for whatever came next. The screen in front of me flickered once, then settled into a clear image, and for the first time in my career, I found myself looking directly at a human being rather than a report about one. He was an older man, perhaps in his middle years by human standards, with short gray hair and a calm, weathered face that showed no trace of anger or triumph, only a quiet, steady attention, as if he were speaking to an old colleague rather than the commander of an invading fleet. Behind him, I could see the interior of a bridge far larger than my own, crewed by dozens of men and women who worked without panic, without urgency, simply going about their tasks as though 4,000 ships appearing at a contested border was, for them, an unremarkable Tuesday. Fleet Commander Vorn Kale, the man said, his voice the same calm, gently accented voice we had heard broadcast across our formation earlier. "My name is Daniel Marsh. I hold the rank of Fleet Admiral in the Defense Forces of the Human Colonial Coalition. I want to thank you for holding your fire. That decision has likely saved a great many lives today on both sides." I did not know how to respond at first. I had prepared over the course of my career for 100 different kinds of first contact, hostile demands, desperate pleas, cold silence. I had not prepared for gratitude. "Admiral Marsh," I said carefully, "my ships hold 4,000 of yours, or so my sensors tell me, surrounding a formation of 30. I do not believe I was given much choice in the matter of holding fire." A faint, tired smile crossed his face. "That is fair, Commander," he said, "though I would ask you to consider something. If we had wanted this to be a battle, it already would be. 4,000 ships do not need to wait 90 seconds after revealing themselves to open fire on 30. We could have ended this before your crew finished registering our presence on their scanners. We chose not to. I would like you to understand why." I glanced at Sella, who stood frozen beside me, her eyes fixed on the screen with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between fear and a kind of stunned, unwilling respect. I gestured for her to remain silent and turned back to the screen. "I am listening," I said. Admiral Marsh leaned forward slightly, his hands folded in front of him. "2 years ago," he said, your council began quietly gathering intelligence on our colonies, our shipyards, our economic capacity, our political structure. We knew, almost from the beginning, because we had been watching your border for considerably longer than that, ever since the first unexplained energy signatures began appearing near our outer settlements. We did not know who you were at first. We only knew that something was watching us, carefully and patiently, and that whoever it was seemed to be forming conclusions about what we were capable of. I felt my jaw tighten. You allowed us to believe you were weak, I said, deliberately. We allowed you to believe what your own instruments told you, Admiral Marsh corrected gently. We did not falsify your reports, Commander. We simply chose not to correct them. Our shipyards that appeared small were exactly as small as they appeared. What your reports did not capture was how much of our fleet had already moved beyond those shipyards, dispersed, and hidden long before your observation satellites were ever placed. Your intelligence was not wrong about what it saw. It was incomplete about what it could not see, and we made certain, over a great deal of time and effort, that it would remain incomplete for as long as necessary. Why, I asked. Why let us believe you were unprepared, only to reveal all of this now, at the worst possible moment for both our people? Because your council was going to attack regardless of what we did, Admiral Marsh said, and for the first time, something harder entered his voice, though his tone remained level and calm. We watched your war chamber debates through channels I am not able to describe to you. We watched your counselor Thess argue for 2 years that our species was a threat that needed correcting before it grew too strong to control. We watched him win that argument slowly, meeting by meeting, until war became not a possibility but a certainty. We could not stop your council from choosing violence. We could only choose how that violence would be answered, and we decided, a long time ago, that it would be answered with a demonstration rather than a massacre. I stood in silence for a long moment, processing what he had said. Around me, my bridge crew worked quietly at their stations, listening, and I could feel the weight of their attention pressing against my back as heavily as the weight of the human fleet pressing against our formation outside. A demonstration, I repeated. Yes, he said. If we had simply defended Ashgrove Station when your fleet arrived, your council would have called it luck, or a lapse in your own preparation, and they would have sent a larger fleet next time, and a larger one after that, until eventually the losses on both sides became too great to ignore, and by then, Commander, too many people would already be dead for either side to walk away from the table. We did not want that outcome. We wanted your council, and your people, to understand exactly what continuing down this path would cost, before a single life was lost, not after. Sela finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. Admiral, she said, how long were your ships positioned around our formation before you revealed yourselves? Admiral Marsh's gaze shifted to her, and something in his expression softened slightly, as though he respected the question. 6 days, he said. The number landed on the bridge like a physical blow. 6 days. We had crossed the border believing ourselves alone, believing our 30 ships held every advantage, and for 6 full days, an invisible wall of 4,000 vessels had surrounded us, watching, waiting, patient beyond anything I had believed possible for a species our reports called young and disorganized. Sela did not speak again. I do not think she trusted her voice. Behind Admiral Marsh, I noticed a younger officer step briefly into view, a woman with dark hair pulled back neatly, carrying a data slate she quietly handed to him before withdrawing again. He glanced at it for only a moment before continuing, and I found myself wondering how many other quiet exchanges like that one had taken place aboard his ship over the past 6 days, how many careful decisions had been made, layer upon layer, to bring us to this exact conversation at this exact moment. It struck me, watching him, that this was not the behavior of a fleet improvising a response to an unexpected threat. It was the behavior of a fleet executing a plan that had been rehearsed and refined long before our 30 ships had ever crossed the border, A plan built not around destruction, but around the precise moment when restraint would carry more weight than any weapon they possessed. I asked him, somewhat cautiously, how many people aboard his fleet had known the full scope of what waited for us at the border. Very few, he admitted. Most of my own captains believed, until the moment we revealed ourselves, that this was a standard defensive posture, nothing more. Secrecy, even among our own ranks, was necessary to ensure that no hint of our true numbers reached your intelligence networks before the right moment. I do not enjoy keeping secrets from my own people, Commander, but I have found over the years that some truths are only useful when revealed all at once, in a single, undeniable moment, rather than leaked slowly where they can be doubted, dismissed, or argued away piece by piece. I forced myself to focus, to think like a commander rather than a man who had just discovered how small his understanding of the universe truly was. What happens now, Admiral? I asked. You have made your demonstration. You have shown us exactly what we did not know. Where does that leave us? That depends on you, Commander, and on your council, he said. We are not here to destroy your fleet. We are not here to take territory or demand surrender. We are here to end this before it becomes something neither of our peoples can undo. I am prepared to open a direct channel between myself and your council, right now, so that they can see with their own eyes exactly what their intelligence reports failed to tell them. I suspect it will change the conversation considerably. I thought of Yoren Thess, of his confident, dismissive voice insisting that humanity was weak, that this was nothing more than a correction, a lesson to a young species about its place in the galaxy. I thought of how quickly that confidence would collapse when faced with the reality currently surrounding my ship on every side. Open the channel, I said. I want to see his face when he understands what he has done. Admiral Marsh gave a small nod, and for just a moment something almost like sympathy crossed his weathered features. I understand this is not an easy position for you, Commander, he said. You followed orders you did not fully agree with, based on information you were given no real reason to distrust. That is not a failure of character. It is the nature of command. I do not hold it against you, and I hope, in time, your own people will not either. I did not know how to respond to that kindness, offered so plainly by a man whose fleet could have erased mine from existence in the time it took me to draw a single breath. I simply nodded and watched as the screen split, a second image appearing beside Admiral Marsh's calm, steady face, the familiar chamber of my own council coming into view, Counselor Yoren Thess seated at its center, his expression shifting in real time from irritation at the interruption to something far colder and more afraid as the numbers on his own displays began climbing past the thousands. And I understood, watching his composure crack apart in front of the entire council chamber, that whatever came next, the war he had been so eager to start had already, quietly and completely, come to its end. Counselor Yoren Thess did not speak for nearly 10 seconds after the numbers appeared on his display, and in the strange, stretched silence of that moment, I watched a man who had spent 2 years insisting on his own certainty discover, in front of his entire council, exactly how wrong that certainty had been. His mouth opened once, closed again, and when he finally found his voice, it came out smaller and less steady than I had ever heard it. This is, he said, then started again. This cannot be accurate, our reports. Your reports were built on what we allowed you to see, Admiral Marsh said, his tone patient but unyielding, the tone of a man who had clearly delivered this same message before and expected to deliver it again. I understand this is difficult to accept, Counselor. I am not here to embarrass you or your council. I am here to prevent a war that would have cost both our peoples far more than either side is prepared to admit. Your fleet commander showed restraint today. I would ask that your council show the same. Counselor Ithra Saul, the older woman who had questioned me more carefully than the others during our earlier exchange, leaned forward at the council table, her face pale but composed. Admiral Marsh, she said, if this fleet had wanted to destroy our formation, our commander tells us it could have done so within moments of revealing itself. Why did it not? Because destruction was never the goal, Admiral Marsh replied. If we had wanted a war, Counselor, we would have simply let your council continue believing what it believed, let your fleets grow bolder over time, and met you eventually with overwhelming force after enough damage had already been done that neither side could back away without enormous loss. Instead, we chose to end the war before its first true battle, at the cost of a single difficult conversation rather than the cost of a generation of grief. I would call that a fair trade, though I understand it does not feel that way to you in this moment. The council chamber fell silent again, and I watched, still standing on my own bridge with Sella beside me, as 2 years of confident policy collapsed under the simple, undeniable weight of 4,000 ships that had appeared from nothing and chosen, deliberately, not to fire a single shot. It was Counselor Ithra Saul who finally spoke the words that mattered most. Admiral Marsh, she said quietly, what do you propose we do now? I propose a formal cessation of hostile movement along our shared border, Admiral Marsh said, effective immediately, followed by a structured diplomatic process to establish clear boundaries, trade agreements, and communication protocols between our peoples going forward. I am prepared to withdraw the majority of our fleet from this position within the hour, provided your council commits, publicly and formally, to the same. I do not believe either of our species benefits from living in fear of the other, and I do not believe today needs to be remembered as the beginning of a war. I would much rather it be remembered as the day both our peoples chose together not to have one. I watched Yorin Thess's expression as he processed this offer, watched the slow, reluctant realization spread across his face that he had no real choice but to accept it, not with 4,000 ships holding position at our border and 30 of ours caught helplessly within their formation. Whatever pride remained in him seemed to finally surrender to simple, practical necessity. We accept the terms, he said quietly, and I do not think I imagined the faint tremor in his voice as he said it. Commander Kale, withdraw the fleet to standard patrol distance, effective immediately. Understood, Counselor, I said, and gave the order. It took nearly 3 hours for our 30 ships to disengage fully from the human formation and return to a safe patrol distance along the border. And throughout that entire process, the human fleet held perfectly still around us, patient and unhurried, never once making a move that could be mistaken for aggression. As the last of our ships cleared the edge of their formation, I watched on my display as, one by one, the human vessels began to fade from view again. Not violently, not suddenly, but slowly and calmly, the same shimmering distortion that had revealed them now folding quietly back around each ship until the space where 4,000 vessels had stood was, once again, empty and dark and silent, as though none of it had ever happened at all. Sella stood beside me at the window for a long time after the last ship vanished, watching the empty stars where, only hours before, an entire fleet had stood revealed. Commander, she said eventually, her voice quiet, do you think they are still out there, cloaked, watching us right now? I do not know, I told her honestly. I suspect we may never fully know, and I think, in a strange way, that not knowing is exactly the lesson they wanted to leave us with. We returned to our own space slowly, the crew unusually quiet throughout the journey home, none of the usual chatter or relief that typically followed the end of a tense mission. I think every person aboard the Ember Crown understood, in their own way, that we had not survived a battle. We had survived the discovery of how little we truly understood about the universe around us, and that kind of survival left a different sort of mark than the kind left by combat. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance as the diplomatic process Admiral Marsh had proposed slowly took shape. Formal boundaries were drawn along the border, carefully negotiated by representatives from both our peoples. None of them soldiers, all of them people trained for the slow, patient work of finding common ground between two species who had come dangerously close to destroying any chance of understanding each other. Trade agreements followed, cautious at first, then steadier as both sides began to see the practical benefits of cooperation rather than conflict. Counselor Yorin Thess resigned from his position within the month, replaced by Counselor Ithra Saul, whose careful, questioning nature, once dismissed by some as excessive caution, was suddenly regarded as exactly the quality our leadership had been missing all along. I received a personal commendation from Counselor Ithra Saul not long after she assumed leadership of the council, though I did not feel I had earned it. I told her as much during our first meeting after her appointment, sitting across from her in the same war chamber where Yorin Thess had once dismissed my concerns so easily. She listened patiently, then told me something I have carried with me ever since. "Commander," she said, "you did not stop a war through cleverness or strength. You stopped it through restraint, by refusing to let fear or pride push you into an action you could not undo. That is a rarer quality among commanders than you might think, and it is exactly the quality this council failed to value until it very nearly cost us everything." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply thanked her and returned to my ship, carrying her words with me the way I still carry Admiral Marsh's. I remained in command of the border fleet, though our patrols changed considerably in the months that followed. Where once we had watched the border with suspicion, expecting hostility, we now watched it with something closer to careful respect, aware that whatever lay beyond our sensors might be far more capable and far more patient than we would ever fully know. I found, strangely, that this awareness did not frighten me the way I expected it to. Instead, it steadied me. There is a kind of peace, I have come to believe, in understanding the true size of the universe around you, even when that understanding humbles you far more than you would like. Sella remained my aide throughout that entire period, and we spoke often, late in our shifts, about what had happened at Ashgrove Station, turning the memory over between us like a stone we could not stop examining. She asked me once, months later, whether I regretted following the council's orders that day, whether I wished I had refused to advance the fleet at all, regardless of the cost to my own career. I thought about the question carefully before answering. No, I told her. If I had refused, another commander would have taken my place, one perhaps less cautious, less willing to hold fire in the face of the impossible. I believe the restraint we showed that day, the simple decision to wait rather than react, is part of why we are all still here to have this conversation. I do not regret following orders I disagreed with. I only wish I had trusted my own instincts sooner and pushed harder against them before we ever crossed that border at all. Admiral Marsh and I spoke again, some months later, through a formal diplomatic channel established as part of the new agreements between our peoples. He looked much the same as he had that day, calm and steady, though there was a warmth in his expression during that later conversation that had not been present during our first tense exchange. He told me that humanity had never wanted conquest, had never wanted to see either of our species destroyed in a war neither could fully win. He told me that the demonstration at the border had been a difficult decision, one debated for a long time among his own leadership, weighing the risk of revealing so much of their true strength against the alternative of allowing a war to unfold slowly and bloodily over years. He told me quietly that he was glad it had not come to that. I asked him once, near the end of that conversation, why his people had chosen restraint that day, when overwhelming force would have been so much simpler, so much more certain a way to end any future threat from our side of the border permanently. He was quiet for a moment before answering, and when he did, his answer stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that entire encounter. "Because strength without restraint is not wisdom, Commander," he said. "It is only cruelty wearing a stronger uniform. We wanted your people to understand what we were capable of, yes. But more than that, we wanted you to understand what we chose not to do with that capability, because that choice, in the end, is what will actually determine whether our two species can share this part of the galaxy in peace, rather than merely in silence, waiting for the next mistake to bring us back to the edge of war." I think of those words often, even now, long after the border settled into something resembling quiet cooperation between our peoples. I think of the 30 ships I brought to Ashgrove Station, confident and unprepared, and the 4,000 ships that revealed themselves around us without ever firing a single shot, choosing, in that critical moment, to end a war through demonstration rather than destruction. I think of Counselor Yoranthes, whose confident certainty collapsed so completely once faced with a truth his own intelligence reports had never allowed him to see. I think of Sella, standing beside me at the window, watching an empire's worth of assumptions dissolve in the span of 90 silent seconds. And I think, most of all, of Admiral Marsh's calm, steady voice, explaining that his people had chosen mercy not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to know the difference between winning a war and ending one before it truly began. I have commanded fleets for over 20 years, and I have studied strategy and strength and the cold mathematics of conflict for most of my life. But I did not fully understand, until that day at the border, that the greatest display of power I would ever witness would not be measured in ships or weapons or numbers on a screen. It would be measured in silence, in restraint, in 4,000 vessels that appeared from nothing, surrounded us completely, and then, having made their point with perfect clarity, simply chose not to fire. That, I have come to believe, is the truest lesson humanity taught us that day. Not that they were strong, though they clearly were, but that their strength was matched, and perhaps even exceeded, by their patience, and that a species capable of holding both in perfect balance is not one to be corrected, or tested, or underestimated ever again. The war ended before it began, not because we won, and not because we lost, but because someone stronger than either side chose, quietly and deliberately, to end it before either of us had the chance to make a mistake we could never take back. I carry that lesson with me still, every time I stand at the window of my ship and look out at the border, wondering, as I always do now, what patient, watchful presence might be waiting just beyond the edge of what my sensors can see. Sometimes, late in a quiet shift, Sella joins me at that window, and we talk about small things: the crew, the slow, steady progress of the new trade routes, the strange comfort of a border that has stayed calm for longer than either of us expected. She asked me once if I thought humanity would ever reveal themselves that fully again, whether some future crisis might once more require 4,000 ships to rise silently out of nothing to remind us of a lesson we had already learned. I told her I hoped not, that the whole purpose of what happened that day was to make certain such a demonstration never needed to happen twice. But I also told her that if it ever did become necessary again, I would rather stand on this side of that lesson than be the commander who forced humanity to teach it to someone else. Corin Vale, the young technician I had watched humming quietly over a coolant line before we ever crossed the border, still serves aboard the Ember Crown to this day, though he has been promoted twice since that mission and now oversees an entire engineering team of his own. I asked him once, half in jest, whether he remembered that quiet hour before we set out for Ashgrove Station. He laughed and told me he remembered it clearly, mostly because it was the last time the ship had ever felt completely ordinary to him. Every mission since, he said, carries a little of that day with it, a quiet awareness that the universe is larger and stranger and far more patient than any of us had ever truly understood. I think that awareness is, in the end, the truest gift Admiral Marsh and his fleet left us with. Not fear, though fear was certainly present in those first terrible moments. Not resentment, though I know some among our people still carry a quiet bitterness about how close we came to catastrophe. What remains, for me, and I believe for many who stood on that bridge beside me, is a deeper, steadier humility, the kind that comes only from looking directly at the true size of something you had convinced yourself you understood, and finding yourself, instead, standing at the very edge of how much you still had left to learn.